Peace and Justice Congregation since 1920. I should read you the bigger statement of purpose that we used to read every Sunday to start our meeting, but I don't have, it's in the membership book. Come and see our membership book that you could even sign and become a member if you dig what we do here and think that we're groovy. That was making it sound pretty trite, wasn't it? It sounds very official and wonderful in the membership book, but join us here. We light this candle this morning in memory of Marguerite Helen Veld. Marguerite was the longtime partner of our deepest, dearest Jim Casteris. Jim Casteris, who took care of this building for 30 years and was deeply active in our governance and in everything we did. He was just the most active member I can think of. Jim now lives in Maine with his daughters. He goes back and forth between two daughters in Maine. And his partner, Marguerite, just passed. She was in hospice for a long time, and she's no longer with us. And I remember Marguerite for her own activism and pacifism with the Quakers in Wellesley, and I also remember her son who sent us the email of her passing. Marguerite was mostly my way to get to Jim. She answered the phone, and I would ask for Jim. Jim, we have flooding in the basement. Jim, we have a broken window on the front door. Jim, what shall I do about this or that? And he was always there. And now we're in touch with Jim. If any of you would like to give Jim a call or send him a card, I have his address and his directions and would love to give them to you. He'd love to hear from us, although he has some cognitive things going on. He's in his late 80s now. But I just really remember fondly Marguerite Helen Veld. I also send this candle of concern, this light from Community Church, to Ron Elbert, our recent board member. He stepped down a year ago, who is just recovering from a deep coma that he's been in for about 2 weeks. And he's at Mass General Hospital. I can give you his information as well. And we don't know the prognosis, but Ron, we're thinking about you right now here at the church. If I stood out in the rain night, my only light a candle 1,000,000 miles away, would you lay down your fire as I raised mine? Would you not kill again? And oh, when you're near me, oh my love, oh my joy, there's nothing ever to weary me. Oh my darling one, ours is a simple faith. Life is a short embrace. Heaven is in this place every day. Hope is the ground we till. Make each day what you will. Thankful for dreams fulfilled every day. We have a short program this morning, but just as delicious as any other program. And the reason is that we will have our annual meeting when we're done here. That'll be at 1. So we hope to be concluding early enough so we can enjoy Luis's lunch here, those who are physically present, and get into the substance of our meeting by 1. But I just want to make a couple announcements before we go into today's program. I'll introduce the presenter, and we're going to watch a beautiful film that Matt has made. The announcements are as follows. After our annual meeting, we have only one more Sunday presentation. That is next Sunday. Dr. Robert Bellinger, for the occasion of the weekend of Juneteenth, will be speaking on slavery and emancipation. A public historian's view is the name of the address. We have wonderful gospel music as well. After that, we have a new addition to our newsletter, and that is something that came up at the last minute, and that is the Golden Rule. The Golden Rule is a historic vessel that plied the waters of the Pacific in the 50s, trying to disrupt United States nuclear tests in places like Bikini and Alamogordo. And they were prevented from doing that. They were stopped by the Navy and turned back. And there was another sister ship that tried to do the same thing, and the same thing happened. But they, for many years, were in the waters of the world, spreading the message of ridding the world of nuclear weapons from the face of God's planet. And the boat fell into disrepair and was in California about to be basically scrapped. And Veterans for Peace took up the cause of restoring this vessel. And it has been fully restored, and it has plied the waters of the Pacific, the Mississippi, and now it is coming up the East Coast, and it will be in Boston at Fan Pier from June 18th to June 22nd. And among the festivities on June 19th, that's a Monday evening at 5:30, will be a reception that we're putting on for the crew of the Golden Rule. And we're very excited about this reception, about hearing from them, seeing a little documentary film about them, and maybe having some music. I'm trying to get this friend Jeff Kaufman, who is the world's finest sea shanty singer, and he told me initially, oh, I can't do it. And now he's saying, maybe I can, maybe I can't. So we'll see if Jeff Kaufman comes. If not, there will be other wonderful maritime-oriented music about not only ships, but music about hope and believing that there is a nuclear weapons-free future for this planet. And then we finish that event and we go to sleep for a couple of days and look on to our summer, which has one magnificent event that, thanks to Amar Ahmad, has been put together and will be very carefully covered. We just found out we have a camera crew will come, and this is that we're hosting an address by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and that's on Wednesday, July 12th. And it will be held in the auditorium of Roxbury Community College. It's sort of a throwback to community church's old days when we met in huge auditoriums and had audiences of up to 2,500 people in Symphony Hall who came to hear W.E.B. Du Bois or Martin Luther King or Hubert Humphrey or Robert Frost, or the list is very long. Margaret Sanger. It's a remarkable history, and I'd love to guide you through it anytime you want to come down here and go through the archives of our 5th floor. We have open house on Wednesday. Every Wednesday at noon, we serve pupusas, and we take you on a tour of our building. 3rd floor, the Sacco and Vanzetti Bob Datilio room that is filled with historical research materials about the Sacco and Vanzetti case and lots of Bob's books. The 4th floor, the History Project archives, celebrates, and preserves Boston's LGBT history and culture. The 5th floor, our own archives. It's a magnificent thing that we're just dying to share with you and share with the world and preserve and protect as they best deserve. Is that enough announcements? I think so. And I think we're ready to introduce Matt Callahan, who just flew in from Bern, Switzerland, where he and his wife Yvonne Moore live. Matt has presented numerous times at Community Church, and we're always glad to have him back because he always is presenting a new project. And it might have been the book and CD about the songs and activism of James Connolly, the Irish liberation freedom fighter of the early 20th century. It might be a book about working class heroes. It might be a book about his upbringing in the 60s era love generation of Berkeley and San Francisco. And it might be what we're going to hear about today, which is this wonderful project that we have for sale here at the church. We're going to get an extra couple copies for anyone who wants to get a copy for themselves, and we'll have one for our library signed by Matt Callahan. And this is about slavery, songs of slavery and emancipation. And we're really eager to welcome Matt and to hear and to see the film that Matt has very meticulously put together. Matt Callahan, thank you for joining us. Yeah.
Thank you all. Okay. Well, here we go.
Oh, that's better. Yeah.
All right. Good. Thank you for having me. I'm going to only give a brief introduction, and then the film speaks for itself, and then if time permits, we'll have discussion, question and answer after the film. This is the book for those on Zoom. It's called Songs of Slavery and Emancipation. The setup for the film, which, as I said, is self-explanatory because it is the making of this project. It'll explain where it came from, where the ideas came from. But I want to say two things quickly. One is about myself, not because I want to call attention to myself, but in terms of the discovery of the song that began this project, why it impressed me, has to do with the fact that I grew up listening to, among other musics, Negro spirituals. So I was actually fully, you might say, aware as a young musician of the literature having to do with the Negro spirituals, for example, Go Down Moses and Many Thousands Gone, and a whole variety of other songs to which, not only did I pay attention, but was influenced by as a musician. That's one part. The other part, and the reason that part is important, is actually, as you'll hear in the film, it was my surprise at finding a song that I'd never heard of that launched this project, and it was so unlike the spirituals that I was familiar with that it attracted my attention. So that's point one. The other thing is that you might say the understanding of the American history in terms of the Civil War, slavery, and the role of the abolitionists, I thought I knew. I thought I had some kind of a grasp of that because I'd actually read many books on the subject. But it wasn't until I found the source of these songs and followed that trail that it became clear that the actual history of the American Civil War and the abolition of slavery had not been correctly represented in the books and the history that we're all familiar with. Very, very briefly, let me just read from this to the conclusion, which we can then discuss later. You'll hear it come out in the film. Now, where is this now? Okay. The basic fact, and this concerns the slave revolts, the role of the slave revolt and slave resistance in the abolition of slavery. The basic fact that slave revolts erupted from the beginning to the end of slavery led to a number of consequences. Had slaves not rebelled, there would have been no abolitionist movement. Without an abolitionist movement, there would have been no Civil War. This war might not have been won without the almost 200,000 slaves who joined the Union Army and Navy in fighting the Confederacy. Certain songs included in this collection bear witness to this often overlooked aspect of history. The triumph of the enslaved and their supporters was the abolition of slavery. The betrayal of the promise of post-Civil War Reconstruction is most responsible for the burial of this history and this music. Until the civil rights movement of the 1960s and 70s began to undo the damage, the old planters and their capitalist brethren in the North were successful enough in propagating their self-serving version of history that even as resistance continued, they would leave a pile of debris through which subsequent generations have had to dig. That's the setup. The film will now tell you the story of how this project came to be and how it was realized. After the film, we can discuss it further. Okay? Are you ready? Go for it.
I am thinking today about times past away, when they tied me up in bondage long ago. In old Virginia state is where we separate, and it fills my heart with misery and woe.
In my experience, what I've seen is that we as a society really do suffer from a historical amnesia, and that comes from simply not valuing history. So most Americans have either very shallow understanding of our history, oftentimes a distorted understanding of our history, but it's a lack of understanding that really does have major ramifications for the kind of society that we're becoming. So I think that if we do have hope of resurrecting what this country purports to be, a democratic, egalitarian society, that it has to come through re-engaging the real story of this country.
They took away my boy, Lord, he was his mother's joy. A baby from the cradle him we raised. Then they put us far apart, and it broke the old man's heart in those agonizing, cruel slavery days.
I was in an old bookshop in San Francisco, not actually looking for anything in particular, but in a section of historical books having to do with slavery and Civil War and so on, and I found this. The title, Negro Slave Revolts in the United States, 1526 to 1860, immediately caught my attention. First of all, Negro slave revolts is a subject that most people don't even know about. And secondly, the date, 1526, because anybody who's at all familiar with the history of slavery in the United States usually refers to 1619, when a Dutch slave trader unloaded a human cargo at Jamestown, Virginia. That's usually the date that people say the slave trade began in the United States. 1526 is almost 100 years before, and it's only 34 years after Columbus bumped into America. And so that piqued my interest a great deal, and I bought the book. I found out that not only was 1526 the beginning of the actual slavery in North America, with the first load of slaves brought by a Spaniard. But it was also the first slave revolt, because these slaves at this particular colony, which was formed in South Carolina, did indeed rebel. The colony itself collapsed. The slaves absconded or ran away to the native peoples who were living in the area, and that was the beginning. The beginning of what? The beginning of slavery on the one hand, but the beginning of this story.
I learned about this project through the president of our college, Lyle Rudolph. He sent me an email, would I be interested in being involved in a project of recording these old songs, abolitionist and slave songs? And the answer was, of course, I would be interested in it, not knowing any more than that. So then I got to meet the great Matt Callahan and talk with him about the journey that he's taken over these last 2-3 years of pulling up music that songs that I had never heard of before. And my specialty is teaching African American music, and I had never heard these songs. What? So I was even more intrigued by the prospect. So then when Matt sent me some examples of the music and samples of it, I was reading about them and very excited. And Lyle asked if I'd be interested in having being a part of putting together a recording for some of this music.
Apparently this song was sung or composed by and sung by slaves preparing for an insurrection in South Carolina in 1813. And the words to this song are, "Arise, arise, shake off your chains. Your cause is just, so heaven ordains. To you shall freedom be proclaimed. Raise your arms and bare your breasts. Almighty God will do the rest. Blow the clarion's warlike blast. Call every Negro from his task. Wrest the scourge from Buckra's hand and drive each tyrant from the land. Firm united let us be, resolved on death or liberty. As a band of patriots joined, peace and plenty we shall find." Now, I grew up listening to Go Down Moses, Many Thousands Gone, Steal Away, and a number of other great Negro spirituals, but I'd never heard a lyric like this one.
Firm united let us be, resolved on death or liberty. As a band of patriots join, peace and plenty we shall find. Arise, arise, shake off your chains. Your cause is just, so heaven ordains. To you shall freedom be proclaimed. To you shall freedom be proclaimed. Raise your arms and bare your breast. Almighty God will do the rest.
So my vision of who would sing was just to pull together my friends from many different areas. So I pulled together friends from the church communities here that I knew, some really powerful, wonderful singers in the style, invited them to participate. I invited some of my students who were in that gospel choir to participate, and I invited some friends from the American Spiritual Ensemble who are professional singers, but one of the things that they do is participate in this group, which is itself about restoring, preserving, and sharing the Negro spiritual. So folks answered the call and we got together, and it was just such a wonderful event of sharing with people from different generations, different performance aspects, some who were first-year students and never really sung all the way into some seniors who have sung all their lives, professional people who have sung around the world, all on this one theme and idea of bringing to life these powerful, powerful songs that helped our ancestors, my ancestors, to live, to survive, to conquer, to overcome, to have hope, to move forward, to make a mark that over 100 years later, we were able to pick up that mantle and continue on.
It's very easy to go to like a Black studies section or an African American studies section. It's very easy to go to Netflix and kind of choose your algorithm. Like, I want to see a Black movie that's a documentary and things like that. But it's hard for us to imagine that there was a time when that was not available, right? That a lot of the history that we're talking about today came from insurgent sources. They came from people doing research and deep into archives, going deeper into archives and then representing that work as a category of Black history. Part of the reason that that's the case was the fact of the matter is that at the end of the Civil War, there was a concentrated effort, right, amongst the ruling elites in this country to bury the radical history of the Civil War.
We want no cowards in our band that from their colors fly. We call for valiant-hearted men that are not afraid to die. Children, we all shall be free. Children, we all shall be free. Children, we all shall be free when the Lord shall be. We see the pilgrim as he lies with glory in his soul. To heaven he lifts his longing eyes and bids this world adieu. Children, we all shall be free.
I was impressed with the fact that there were abolitionist songs in this collection of songs. The whole abolitionist movement is not understood. You know, it's marginal in the telling of this story.
For a long time, revisionist historians of the Civil War had portrayed it as a needless conflict and one that was brought about by fanatics, North and South. And abolitionists were seen as these extremists, these religious fanatics who had no idea what they were doing, and that they sort of created a problem for the country by raising the issue of slavery in a very strident way. And of course, that view of abolition had been challenged, by African American historians. And during the Civil Rights Movement, you had sort of an alternative picture of abolitionists as radical activists, particularly because civil rights activists wanted to sort of look back at history and look at predecessors. And they saw abolitionists as fighting for similar things that they were fighting for, racial equality, Black citizenship.
People who were the generation after the revolutionaries see that the promise of freedom for all that was part of the revolution is not being fulfilled. And they engage themselves in the process of fulfilling that promise. And of course, the big issue at the time, two of them really, but the largest one was in the early part of the 1830s was abolition, and out of that was spawned the women's rights movement. And it happened that in central New York, there were a few people who had the means of doing something about that. Gerrit Smith, of course, was one of them.
His influence on abolition at the time was huge. Frederick Douglass, who came to Rochester and wanted to produce the Liberty newspaper, didn't have the finances to do it. He came to Peterborough to get money from Gerrit Smith. John Brown, this radical zealot who wants to bring about an armed reaction to the slavery situation and ends up attacking Harper Ferry, comes to Peterborough and knocks on the door seeking financial and moral support, which, shockingly enough, Gerrit gave him.
You know, going back to the history of abolition, Germany played a tremendous key role in that. Many of the folks who immigrated to the United States in the 19th century were 1848ers. They landed in New York or other places and started socialist newspapers. But the core of what they were thinking about and writing about was abolition of slavery.
Following the defeat of the revolutions of 1848, many revolutionaries, especially Germans, emigrated to the United States. Known as the 48ers, they were very active in the abolitionist movement. Eventually, 200,000 German-born soldiers would serve in the Union Army.
The other interpretation that was very influential and continues to be to a certain extent was this notion that abolitionists just focused on slavery and they were blind to other wrongs in their society, and that in an indirect way they sort of justified or legitimized the rise of wage labor and of capitalism. And when I started looking at abolitionist papers, particularly the Garrisonians, who were the sort of more radical wing of the movement, I found that they were actually fairly perceptive and fairly critical of many other wrongs in their society. That caricature of the abolitionist as an armchair philosopher was simply not correct.
Was first contacted with the possibility that I might be able to contribute some banjo or fiddle music that would be appropriate to the time period and relate to the abolition movement. But as it turned out, my dissertation deals with a tradition that very few people were aware of that speaks directly to the topics at hand. Shape note singing as a contemporary practice with these roots that go back to the 18th century and beyond, if you want to get into it, that is something that groups of us as friends, as community members get together to do largely from The Sacred Harp, a book first published in 1844. There are other books as well. That's one thing. Second thing is old folks concerts, which were a practice singing many of the same songs starting in the mid-19th century in New England. That it was a tradition, it was a fad that became a tradition. And the third thing is abolitionist singing, which employed old folks concerts that included some of these songs, as well as some of those same tunes, but with new texts that specifically addressed the issues of the day. Having done all this research about the connections between this shape note music that we sang as a community of friends and the abolition movement, I became really excited about getting the word out that this was kind of a part of the unknown soundtrack, the silent soundtrack of the abolition movement, and the reasons why it made sense, the reasons why people used it were as interesting as the music itself. They wanted to reach people where they were. And using popular song was a really good way to do that. Henry Wright, this anarchist abolitionist who was involved in leading one of these old folks concerts up the river a bit, he was the first one to really recognize that potential, because he saw the whole community coming out and how, he saw the tears in people's eyes, and he saw that this was music that really reached them and reminded them of the hearth, reminded them of home. And he wrote in a letter to William Lloyd Garrison, he said, imagine getting those people to that place where they're just full of nostalgia and feeling of their youth and family and home, and then introduce this topic. Well, what if you were enslaved? What if your child was enslaved? What does home mean to you? What would that bring to mind? So he saw it as really an effective tool of getting right into their souls.
Come join the abolitionists, ye young men bold and strong, and with a warm and cheerful zeal, come help the cause along. Come join the abolitionists, ye men of riper years, and save your wives and children dear from grief and bitter tears, from grief and bitter tears, from grief and bitter tears, and save your wives and children dear from grief and bitter tears. Oh, that will be joyful, joyful, joyful. Oh, that will be joyful when slavery is no more, when slavery is.
My job also was envisioning how we would want to arrange the music, wanting to put as much of the authenticity as I felt like I could share with it, while at the same time wanting to remain true to what we had. So it's always a bit of a challenge, because you need to know, well, who was the transcriber when they wrote the music? Did they write down the pitches as they thought they should be, or as they actually heard them? And if it's in the Black singing style, we don't even have all of the correct nomenclature to get all of the side twists and all of that stuff in it. So there was an understanding in the performance practice that we wanted to add some of that. The fact that John G. Fee, the founder of this college, was being inducted into the Abolitionist Hall of Fame was the connection that helped make us a part of this project. The choir, the Black Music Ensemble, the choir that I was directing, went to Peterborough, New York for the ceremony. During that induction process, the director of that museum got to know about Berea even more and about our really special history. And so when the producer was looking for a group to sing this kind of music, Berea came up. We have a history of being a place full of abolitionists, trailblazers, folk making a difference, we stand on the shoulders of those who did that in Berea College.
My father, how long? My father, how long? My father, how long? Till we done suffering here.
My mother, how long? Oh, my mother, how long? My mother, how long?
For we done suffering here.
I was led to the Library of Congress and into the archives that have been collecting since the Civil War. And I looked through literally dozens, if not hundreds, of books, pamphlets, broadsides. These were little one-sheet things that were sold on the street in the United States with songs on them and so on. And I kept coming across what I would consider to be kind of a pattern, which was that the song collectors themselves, some of them in the early 20th century, some in the late 19th century, all came at it with a certain attitude about slaves, slavery, black people and their music, and so on, and apparently either did not hear any songs like this or didn't want to hear any songs like this. This is, of course, a matter of speculation. But I did uncover two things that led me to the conclusion that there were, in fact, more songs than had been collected by, let's say, traditional song collectors. The first was a piece of sheet music that was published in 1820, and it was called the Recognition March for the Independence of Haiti. And it was an instrumental piece, but just the title alone told me that there was something really important here. And the composer of this piece was Francis Johnson, and I found out later that he was a free man of color and was a accomplished composer and Kent bugle player. And it so happens that he was among the most popular band leaders of his era. In fact, he was hired to compose a march and lead a band for the triumphant return of the Marquis de Lafayette to Washington, D.C. So this man was obviously of some standing as a musician. And then I found another song, and this, in this case, was actually a recorded piece of music. And it was a 93-year-old man named Elijah Cox singing a song called Agonizing, Cruel Slavery Days. Those two songs told me that there is more here than had been put into these collections, which the collections themselves stand as the canon of Negro folk music or slave music in the United States.
On one side of slavery, you have that awful oppression, but on the other side, you also have enslaved people resisting their enslavement. And they could do it by rebellions, by running away, but many of them also wrote about their oppression. The poems of Phyllis Wheatley, who was a genius by any standard. She is one of the first American women to be ever published, not just one of the first Black women to be ever published. And I found that it was really important to look at these early Black writings and see them as part of the abolition movement, which is a way that they had never been looked at. A lot of literary scholars had looked at early writings, essays written in protest, poetry, etc. But historians did not think of that as abolitionist material. But it is important to recover their voices and to hear what they have to say in terms of fighting against slavery, fighting for their rights, and fighting for freedom.
It's worth noting that many of the songs in this collection were not recorded by song collectors, ballad hunters, folklorists, or whatever, but in fact were preserved by people who were directly engaged in the struggle against slavery, for the emancipation of the slaves. And for example, Samuel Chapman Armstrong, who was the leader of the 9th Regiment U.S. Colored Troops, and he recorded this song, which in a book is called The Enlisted Soldiers, but he gave it a different name. His notation about this song is the following. While recruiting and drilling the 9th Regiment U.S. Colored Troops at Benedict, Maryland in the winter of 1863-64, the men gathered around the campfire would sing by the hour the melodies of the plantation slave life that they had just left, not always very melodious. But late one evening, I was startled by a magnificent chorus from nearly 1,000 black soldiers that called me from my tent to listen to its most inspiring strains, and I caught the following words, which I called the Negro Battle Hymn.
They look like men, they look like men of old, all armed and dressed in uniform, they look like men of war. It sets my heart quite in a flame, a soldier just to be. I will enlist, gird on my arms, and fight for liberty.
What I liked about the songs, which I think is part of the reason why some of them disappeared in some respects, because they speak to a certain level, to me, of revolutionary clarity. You know, some of it's coded, but if you know the code, it's very clear about, you know, fighting back and keeping the quest going, you know, until we kind of reached the land of the North Star. That was very clear, you know, from the songs. And I think, you know, much like we used a lot of the work of Sweet Honey in the Rock in particular, in some of our kind of anthem songs and get out and move songs and things to inspire us. And when I was sharing it with some of our staff, you know, just even earlier today, some of the music, that was the thing that immediately popped into people's minds. And it's interesting because I made a comment that, you know, it's like, oh, I hear Sweet Honey in the Rock. And I was like, actually, it's the reverse. You hear them building on this legacy. This is just you know, Sweet Honey in the Rock is just more the version that you are familiar with, since it's a little bit more contemporary. But what it speaks to is the foundation of that tradition, and these styles go back, you know, probably over 200, 300 years at this point, if we could even dig further, and I think find some material. So it's very relevant in the here and now.
Bernice Reagan once said, she's the great song archivist, singer, from her voice is iconic in terms of Eyes on the Prize, those early films about the civil rights movement. Bernice Reagan said, we will never be free until we learn these songs. And she was talking specifically about spirituals, but in very broad terms, we will never be free. We talked earlier about how oftentimes spirituals use coded language. I'm going to Canaan's land. I'm going, you know, to see Jesus, when really you mean heaven, and all of those things. But in these songs that you brought to us, that you researched, the language was raw. The language said, I'm going to Canada. I had never seen a spiritual that out and out said, I'm going to Canada. I'm going to do this, singing Nat Turner's praise, all of those things.
Nat Turner was the leader of perhaps the most famous slave revolt in the United States. Launched on August 23, 1831 in Southampton, Virginia, Nat Turner's rebellion shattered the image of the docile, contented slave.
The one that sticks out in my mind the most about the misconceptions that are out there is that Nat Turner, you know, the Nat Turner rebellion was not viewed as a major source of inspiration, and that his form of resistance was not praised, celebrated, and thought about and contemplated, and I'm sure tried many, many times over in many places, in stories that were often buried or untold. And it just counters this narrative that somehow, you know, black people, my ancestors, that we just kind of accepted our fate, didn't resist, when in fact the resistance was constant, multifaceted, very nuanced and very complex. And that it also, I think, really shaped the reality. It doesn't mean that slavery ended, but it changed the terms and conditions of slavery, you know, and I think that was very clear from these songs, and it speaks to what Du Bois called the Great Strike. You know, like once the Civil War started, how the word spread like wildfire, and how people just immediately stole themselves and got into motion and got into action.
The argument that Du Bois is making in Black Reconstruction about the general strike and the role of the slaves in emancipating themselves is that slaves seized the opportunity presented by the outbreak of war. Countless thousands stopped working, abandoned the plantations, and sought out the Union Army both for refuge and to offer their support. At first, they were employed as laborers, cooks, nurses, and spies, but as the war dragged on, their determination to fight could no longer be ignored. Eventually, 180,000 black men, the majority of them former slaves, fought in the Union Army. 20,000 more fought in the Union Navy. An additional 200,000 formerly enslaved men, women, and children would come to provide their labor in support roles behind the Union lines. Thus, the slaves themselves proved decisive in turning a war to save the Union into a war to abolish slavery.
And you could literally, just hear these songs in the background. Like once we're introduced to them, you can hear them in the background. And I can imagine somebody running from, Tennessee to part of Ohio or something like that, or, somewhere in the Carolinas or Virginia, or Maryland, heading up to Pennsylvania or to New York, singing these songs. I mean, that's very clear that they were alive, vibrant, because they speak to specific issues in history. All of them do, that I heard. They all speak to specific references in history, and that tells you that old school underground, railroad and the grapevine, how it worked, that these songs were kind of, the soundtrack, if you would, of that action.
You can't keep the world from moving around. Nor that Turner from gaining ground. You can't keep the world from moving around. Nor that Turner from gaining ground. You might be rich as cream and drive you coach and four-horse team, but you can't keep the world from moving around. Nor that Turner from gaining ground. You can't keep the world from moving around. Nor that Turner from gaining ground.
A lot of contemporary black music, from gospel, blues, right down to jazz, can we trace right all back to the slave spirituals. This is an authentic American musical tradition brought to us by enslaved people. I think that is something that the broader public should be made aware of, that we should hear more of this, so that people realize that enslaved people made a tremendous contribution to the cultural and political life of this country. We don't think of their contributions in that way.
History is a powerful weapon. Memory is a powerful weapon. Culture is a powerful weapon. And these songs represent all three. And, if you're trying to keep a subject captive population, in abject poverty and exploitation, you have to remove all the tools of inspiration, all the tools of organizing that they might possess. You have to kind of strip them bare of that. And we have to remember, I think what these songs really bring to mind is the level of just damage and terror that was done basically from the end of Reconstruction really up until the 1960s. And I don't think there's, this is another period of where I think we need some more work. One of them I think is like Without Sanctuary, the picture book of lynchings, and people forget those were postcards. That those were mailed around. They were common currency. You could probably find them at, all Woolworth stores and all the little mom and pop stores. I'm sure throughout the South, but probably far beyond that as well. And that, if you look at that was something that was commonplace. That was erased. And why was that erased? It was erased so that people would forget the horrors, the systemic horrors that were perpetrated against black people and Puerto Ricans and Mexicans and women and working class white people in number. It was just erased, but particularly around black people. But in order to kind of maintain that apartheid state, you have to remove all the different signs and post signs of resistance. Without that, if you don't do that, somebody's going to pick that tool up and figure out, oh, I can do something with this. You know, I'm inspired to do something with this. And they had to remove that, you know, and that removal is ongoing. I mean, we need to be mindful. It's one of the things that just in my work here in Cooperation Jackson, you know, I'm one of the elders, if you can believe that, in some of the work. We work with a lot of young folks, and how much history, even from the 70s, 60s, 50s, of the struggle right here in Jackson, right here in Mississippi, has been completely erased because it's not taught in any public schools. You know, it's not a lot of the institutions of resistance have kind of generationed out or been destroyed or undermined or lost funding and lost resources. So that institutional history and memory of resistance and how to organize, even that close in history, has been totally, you know, kind of wiped out. And I'm not just talking about because people have passed on, but I mean like very intentionally stamped out by how the school districts, you know, do their curriculum, to the extent that, you know, there's been a battle here in Mississippi to adopt one of the Texas curriculum books. And there's one which really tried to describe, you know, chattel slavery as like a voluntary act, or like, you know, like it was kind of a market choice. Which is utterly ridiculous. But the point of it is to obscure history, to deny racism, to deny the settler colonial aspect of this society, to just replicate this kind of right-wing notion that what we're doing is fine. There's no need to seek justice. The order of things of who's on top and who's on the bottom, that's natural, and it should be perpetrated, you know, well into the future. And so, yeah, destroying this cultural legacy, particularly, you know, calling for freedom, calling for rebellion, as many of these songs do, they had to wipe this out.
There needs to be a unique challenge to the culture industry in terms of like the global Black community. And the fact of the matter is that Black producers, and not just Black producers, but a multiracial force within the culture industry, has to have an impact upon the narratives that are simply told about Black people. Because when we don't have control over that, then simply put, it becomes this very kind of like weird dialectic when slavery was something that happened way, way, way back then and has no impact today. And that, you know, and that the images of, like, say, for example, of Barack Obama or successful Black families dominate. And so, and we don't really get the true story around the continuing impact of slavery today.
All of us have heavy hearts. We are watching what is happening in our country. It has been happening all of the time, but we have not been conscious of it. And this music forces us to be absolutely clear-eyed. You know, no Easter Bunny going on here. We know what we are up against. So I am grateful, Kathy, Matt. Thank you. Thank you.
We shall not always weep and groan, and wear these slavish chains of woe. There's a better day that's coming. Come and go along with me. Good Lord, oh, when shall slavery cease, and these poor souls enjoy their peace? Good Lord, break the power. Come and go along with me.
I think that talking with participants in this experience, many were talking about how this project is even bigger than they realize. It's more profound. There were times when we sat and we sung the songs, And I felt so clearly and keenly the ancestors, my ancestors saying, well done. That was speaking for those who cannot speak. That I'm sitting here because of giving their lives and their hearts and minds. And to be able to do that is such an honor and a gift.
I feel like right now we are at a very dark nadir in our history. And I find it almost paralyzing, honestly. So for me, this project has personally been a blessing because it reminds me that things have been really bad in this country before, worse than they are now, way worse. And somehow we came out of it. We came out of it because people got up, they stood up, they did something. And it gives me hope hearing this music, hearing the slave songs, the abolitionist songs, the kind of subversive minstrel songs that things changed and they can change. They can still change.
And now in this specific moment where people are reckoning with the history of decolonization and reckoning with the history of slavery across the board, this is a question of not just a local challenge, but a global challenge. Because when you talk about slavery, you're not just talking about what happened to people in one particular country, but what happened to the globe. A song can travel across borders. A song can travel, even if it's in a different language. You know, it has the ability to tell a story to people who may not speak that language. And that's something that connects us all. I think it was like, you know, music is the connective the music is truly the connective of us all. But I think it's particularly these songs that are so forthcoming in their content about rebellion, you know what I'm saying, about overthrowing, that makes it even more important right now. It does resonate because when you're talking about songs, and particularly songs of emancipation, it's not about having the same experience, but a shared experience. And I think that there's a shared experience around the fight for democracy. There's a shared experience for the fight against racism, and there's a shared experience against the fight against oppression.
I'm reminded shortly after the Civil War, we were talking about Reconstruction and lynchings and all of these things. On one hand, that is an awful, awful time in American history. But it was also a time that African Americans built most of the historic Black colleges and universities. That was a response to oppression and to distress. I hope that these kinds of songs, giving new life to them, giving new arrangements to them, giving new voice, will in 2018, 2019, 2020 cause all of us to respond just as the ancestors did. Do something that moves us from here to here.
My country. Our flag
There's a lot more to say, but in the interest of time, I want to take questions. A lot of people probably missed the first part of the film, but maybe we'll be able to. Maybe we'll be able to catch up. There you go. Now I hear it. All right. I was going to say some more in a prepared manner, but we're limited in time, and I think I would prefer to just open the floor to questions. And if there aren't any questions, then I'll go on. But are there any questions about? Yeah, go ahead. How can I get that? It's free. It's on YouTube. If you have access to a computer, it's Songs of Slavery and Emancipation. It's free. We're screening it like this actually for the sake of people being able to talk about it and to call attention to it. But the film is actually free. The book and the CDs, unfortunately, we have to charge for them, but they're available here. The CDs include 2 hours of music. One CD is slave songs, the other is abolitionist songs. And the distinction between those two is, I mean, I can talk about it, but there's a reason for the distinction. Yes? Is that song on the CD? They're all, everything you heard is on the CD. And this film is obviously the making of. It's not a music video, but there are, in fact, also videos on YouTube, but at least on our website, Art and History and Politics, of these songs being performed. When we launched the CDs, we launched the project in 2022 at Berea College. The entire repertoire was performed. So the songs were filmed, meaning the whole performance of the song. So you can find those on YouTube as well. And if you don't, you can come over to me. There's a flyer there which you can take with you, which has a website, our website, and they're there, all for free. So the only problem is you do have to have access to the internet. It's not, there's no other way to do that. But if you do, then you can actually hear the performances that were of these songs that were performed live. Yes. Can you talk more about that distinction between slave songs? Yes. As I said in the film, the slave songs were what initiated this process. It was the discovery of that song in that pamphlet that aroused my interest and led to the discovery of the other songs. But in the course of the research, it became very clear that the body of abolitionists' songs, along with the abolitionist movement, had been largely erased. Those songs were published. In other words, they were available from songbooks and other sources that were actually published for group singing. So they were not buried in the sense that the slave songs had been. I could find them. You understand what I mean? They're actually, they exist in libraries and archives, but they are not well known. And furthermore, along with the abolitionist songs is who composed these songs and who comprised the abolitionist movement. As was referred to in the film, the abolitionist movement, if it's remembered at all, is usually given the image of essentially bourgeois do-gooders who were offended. Their polite sense of propriety was offended by slavery. But in fact, the abolitionist movement was made up of fugitive slaves, free people of color, and working people. As a matter of fact, people like William Lloyd Garrison were what were called mechanics, and a mechanic was the word used to address an industrial worker, printers, textile workers, and so on and so forth. And so the characterization of the abolitionist movement itself is completely distorted. The actual makeup of the abolitionist movement, both in terms of class and color, is misrepresented historically. And that is particularly clear in the case of one group of songs written by Joshua McCarter Simpson, who himself was a free black person. His parents were slaves. He was actually an interesting case because he would legally have been born a slave, but a deal was made with his owner to make him an indentured servant. And an indentured servant is a different legal category we don't have to get into the whole history of this, but in these labor systems, slavery was one category, indentured servitude was another. And the difference in this case was that by the time he was 20, or 21, I believe, he was free. In other words, he had to work for his master as if he were a slave, but he was going to be freed. And when he was freed, he went to Oberlin College. And in Oberlin College, he became an abolitionist, and he began writing lyrics to popular songs. And these songs were published originally in 1852 in a book of anti-slavery songs, and then again in 1854 in a book called the Emancipation Car. And we drew many of his lyrics. They're all to famous songs. In fact, in a musical sense, this is a bit of a deviation here, but almost all the music here was previously composed for other music, religious music, popular songs or whatever, and the lyrics were what made it revolutionary, or the lyrics were what were contributed by abolitionists. So in McCarter Simpson's case, this was particularly significant for a couple of reasons. First of all, he doesn't fit the mold of the bourgeois do-gooder, and on the other hand, his choice of songs and the use of minstrel tunes in particular was deliberate, because blackface minstrelsy, which was obviously designed to degrade and humiliate black people and to make, reinforce the, segregation and justify slavery, the enslavement of black people, and was enormously popular in the United States. It was even performed by black people. It wasn't just blackface minstrels. Black people actually performed blackface. And Simpson in particular chose these songs and explicitly states in the introduction to his songbooks that he chose these songs, comic Negro songs they were called, to turn their use into its opposite. In other words, to deliberately take something that was being used to oppress and degrade and turn it into a weapon for the abolition of slavery. And again, this changes what we think of the abolitionist movement, and it changes the way we actually even think about American music, which is another very important dimension of this whole project, because actually the development of the struggle against slavery, which in a certain sense is represented in the Negro spiritual, although in coded terms. That's the common, what is commonly known. The fact is that all along that with slave revolts, in particular the Nat Turner Rebellion, there were songs being composed before and after by in some cases free people of color who were actually preaching in the area that Nat Turner's rebellion took place. The African Hymn, one of the songs that you heard, was written by Reverend Shadrach Bassett, who was a preacher for the American Methodist Episcopal Church and was assigned to the region in which Nat Turner was living. And it's pretty clear, although it's almost impossible to prove, that this song, the African Hymn, was one of the things that inspired the Nat Turner Rebellion, and on the other hand got Reverend Shadrach Bassett thrown out of the area. So the point that becomes clear is that you start to follow these songs through their connection to the actual organization of rebellions. The first song, for example, in 1813, this is a story in itself. Now I'm giving the talk that I would have given at the beginning. But when you find the Hymn of Freedom, Arise, Arise, right, this song, the actual song, that took me 2.5 years to find out where that came from. The first song. And I'd found the other songs, and I'd been able to verify their authenticity. I still wasn't able to prove that that song was actually authentic. The pamphlet Herbert Aptheker wrote and published in 1939, Negro Slave Revolts in the United States, 1526 to 1860, did not contain the footnote. It didn't say where it came from. I trusted him, but I had to prove it. You have to prove. Now a little deviation again. One of my rules as a researcher in putting this together was I had to authenticate the slave songs by at least 2, if not 3, different sources. Since they've been buried and people had told me, experts had told me they don't exist. This is a fact. I needed to verify that they were indeed authentic. Had not been written at some other time by some person who wanted history to be other than it actually was. Well, eventually I did find the verification. I won't tell the entire story because it's just tedious. I got leads from this person and that person. But in any case, the real story of that song was that during the War of 1812, the British were positioned off Chesapeake Bay and along South Carolina, that region, and they were offering freedom to slaves who would abscond to them. So this offer was passed amongst plantations and whatever, and this one particular group of slaves were preparing an insurrection to overthrow their master and abscond to the British. It turns out that at the same time, there were what were called camp meetings. This became, it was part of the Second Great Awakening. That's a whole other historical thing. And it was very common at that time for slaves to be able to go. Their masters, if they were so inclined, would allow them to go to these camp meetings. Well, this particular master had given permission to an unusual number of slaves to attend this meeting, and he followed them because his suspicions were aroused. And he overheard, he stayed in the darkness and overheard them having this plan, discussing what to do with the whites, what are they going to do with him, and so on and so forth. And their leader came and sang this song, which he said, I composed this song. And that's the Hymn of Freedom. He wrote down the lyrics. Okay. Now, it took me, as I said, 2.5 years to actually track down the proof of that, and that itself is an elaborate story. But I also wanted to know what was the music. He didn't say anything about the music. But in one of the sources that describes the situation, it was referred to as Hail Columbia. And it just so happens that Hail Columbia was the national anthem of the United States in 1813. And I went and I found a copy of Hail Columbia, and the words fit perfectly. In fact, some of the words in this are from Hail Columbia, the original national anthem. And what you could see is that this person, this leader of this planned insurrection, was making a parody of the national anthem of the United States. And that was turning the words into its opposite, which was very common. It's exactly what Connolly was talking about in the film, and about how these tools were picked up. Somebody hears this song, of course it's right in the middle of a war, everyone's singing this song, you can be sure they heard it frequently, and turns it around into a parody on the one hand, but not a joke. It's not making fun of this, it's mocking the claims of the United States, and it's turning them exactly into their opposite and saying, where is the liberty and justice that you're promising, and so on. So this is the actual source of the first song. And so this is also indicative of, you might say, the whole story in a way. It was not so much about composing the music as it was taking what were popular, because the purpose was to organize. The purpose was to mobilize, bring people together to actually fight back. And this is if there's anything to take away from this, it is that the slave revolt was a crucial and decisive part of American history, the slave revolt, because that continued from the very beginning to the Civil War. And in fact, in some ways, the Civil War itself was a slave revolt. Yeah. We're trying.
If you could repeat the question and before the answer,
sorry.
we didn't have the mic ready.
Have we tried to get this into public schools and make it available? Yes. it's an ongoing effort. University Press of Mississippi published the book, and they're using their means. But you know, let's face it, there are certain aspects of this that are pretty radical. I mean, not deliberately or in an attempt to stir up trouble, quote unquote, but you're challenging American history the way it's taught. And what I just said is kind of the key. It's the fact that the role of slave revolt, you know, that's the kernel of all this. It's what inspired the songs, and it's what led to the Civil War. Yes, please.
I was wondering if you had, is this on? Okay. If you had any record of the songs reflecting an escape to Mexico. I know there was not as much to Canada, but there was an escape route through Mexico. And just a little bit more context of it. I had an accidental encounter with Gerald Horne, a historian, and I asked him the question about Sam Houston and Davy Crockett and the rest of them fighting to restore slavery in Texas. And he said at that point Mexico had already eliminated slavery. I don't think they 100% followed through on it, but he said that Santa Anna's army was freeing slaves as he moved north. I've never been able to pin down a reference to that. I don't know if you know anything about that.
Yeah, two things very quickly. One is the question of Santa Anna, you'd have to do some more research on. I'm sure Horn is correct. But the question of slave songs in relationship to that. I spent another 2 years actually looking for songs in Spanish or Louisiana Creole or French. I found one, and consulting let's call them historical experts, historians that I spoke to about it, they said that for the Spanish, there's a whole legacy of Spanish songs, particularly from Cuba, which was one of the last places to actually abolish slavery, and it's a whole different subject for another researcher to take up and do. But by and large, I was not able to find, outside of a couple of examples, things that were not in English. And so the question is, why were there English texts and not these other texts? And one of the answers, and I'm not saying it's a complete answer by any means, but what I came up with is that people were observed singing, in many cases, but they, meaning during slave revolts or protests of slaves, but either the person who was actually recording it did not understand what they were singing, or they didn't bother to write it down. They didn't bother for some reason, which does not mean that they don't exist. But to date, the people that I consulted say they couldn't find them. Okay. Now, as far as the Mexican case, it's almost a separate subject in and of itself because of its geography and that history. And the truth is that I had to stop at some point. I wanted to get these out. I wanted to make the record complete and open the record, literally 2 CDs, complete, and present it to inspire other people to do more. Because obviously you have to deal with Portuguese, you have to deal with one of the songs that we have, which is from Curaçao, is actually in Pamiento, which is an official language of Curaçao. But those are sort of to whet the appetite of researchers who want to go further and deal with the slave revolts in these other places. Yeah.
Dorothy Weitzman is next. She joins us on Zoom.
Oh, okay.
Hi. Thank you so much. I find this wonderful and so helpful and inspiring. I want to mention my thoughts about the slave revolts. I think I learned from you, and I wish I had known it before, that there was many more slave revolts, and there's some documentation of many more than we knew of before. And most of us only think about the Nat Turner instance, and what we learn is that it inspired some more atrocious slavery than previously, and some greater fear among the slave owners in the South, the holders. And what is your train of argument that says that slave revolts led to abolitionists in the North, for example, or abolitionist movement? Or was it an abolitionist movement among Black people that we didn't know about that came from the revolts? What is the sequence of history that you're believing
Okay.
we should know?
Two things. One is that the sequence, and the second is the relationship of Black people or enslaved or free in the movement. In terms of the sequence of history, I mean, I think that the resistance to slavery goes so far back. It really goes to the beginning. As I said, I don't know if you heard the beginning, but I referenced the Negro slave revolts in the United States 1526, because there was in fact a revolt in the first colony settled by Spaniards in what is now South Carolina. That revolt led to the demolition of that particular colony, and it wasn't until much later that the slave trade really exploded in North America. But resistance to it was continuous. That's the important conclusion that Herbert Aptheker and his research led to, was that there, essentially, as soon as slavery was established, there were revolts. That's one thing. Then along with that was the beginnings, and this is also important for another reason, which I'll get to, the beginnings of writing about it, which were actually written by enslaved people, such as Phyllis Wheatley and Justin Jupiter Hammond, who wrote poetry that was published even while they were slaves, which was talking about the injustice, talking about this. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, because there were actually, even in the 18th century, there were like dozens of books, novels, all kinds of things produced by slaves or former slaves and other free people of color that were protesting and agitating against the whole slave system. And again, this is very important, because that's what led up to what we call abolitionism today, meaning William Lloyd Garrison and what might be called the second wave of abolitionism that took place after the Nat Turner or 1830, in that same period. And I think that, coming back to your point about your question about what's the logic, didn't Nat Turner and other rebellions just lead to greater repression? It did, as a matter of fact. It is exactly true that the resistance to the slaves did increase the brutality and the policing of the slave population, and also of the white population, of making sure that white people were not going to join with Black people and try to fight slavery. In fact, what the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 in particular, but it was true of the earlier ones as well, deputized the entire northern population to aid in the returning of their property to slave owners. That was one of the particular things that agitated the situation, aggravated the situation in which leading directly to the Civil War. But again, the reason the sequence of slave revolts, then abolitionism, I think is fairly obvious. If the slaves had in fact just been compliant and simply accepted their fate, then who would have spoken on their behalf? I mean, what behalf is there to speak on? Because if people have accepted their condition, and let's face it, this goes back a long time. There was an enormous amount of propaganda and education invested in teaching people that slavery was necessary, slavery was good, slavery was something that Christianized the slave, and so on and so forth. I mean, it's hard to imagine today. You have to put yourself back in a different place where this overwhelming educational campaign was there to justify something that was manifestly brutal, horrifying, and very, very difficult to live with. Let's face it. And so I think, I mean, there's so many different aspects of this that, just to make it as clear as I could possibly make it, is that if you take away the slave revolt, if you take away the resistance of slaves, then nothing else makes sense.
I see. Thank you.
I'm sorry. Yep, go ahead.
No, I just said thank you.
Well,
but thank you.
I know there's communication problem. I'm sorry, this woman had her hand up. I just
John, and then Judith, and then we should conclude, because our meeting is at 1, and
I'm sorry.
there's a lunch waiting.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, very quickly. I got here late, but where does Bacon's Rebellion fit into this, culturally, whatever? Is there stuff that remains from that? I think in that rebellion they burned down Jamestown, if I remember right.
Yeah. Well, it's a big I'm afraid that really takes us far afield because it wasn't actually a slave revolt. And it's a different kind of, it's related because it has to do with the American Revolution, and the American Revolution obviously raised these questions of freedom. What does liberty and freedom actually mean? It clearly, you see it expressed in slave songs, you see it expressed in slave revolts. A lot of them were overt and deliberate demands for freedom. And using the language of the Constitution or using the language of the French Revolution. Same is true in Haiti. The Haitian Revolution was articulated through the words of the rights of man. Go ahead.
I was going to ask. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but.
So anyway, I'm asking about songs. Like, didn't my Lord
Yeah.
Rise Up, Shepherd, Follow?
Yeah.
Songs like that. Were those composed by Northerners for some, against slavery? Were they composed by slaves? Can you tell us a little bit about some of the more famous songs that, many of us learned that were about slavery, but I didn't know whether they were Northern abolitionists.
Right. Well, I mean, unfortunately, you have to go song by song. In other words, I'm not sure. In other words, I'd have to go research the song. In many cases, they were derived directly from another church hymn, and then were adapted. This is the way, before copyright, this is normal. This is the way music was composed. This is the way songs were composed. Nobody cared about the ownership. It was a question of you wanted to express something. In the case of religion, it was obviously to propagate the word of God, and I think that to a large extent, the body of the Negro spirituals, most of them, there are known writers. There are known writers for, or at least they claim credit. Go Down Moses was written, you can see it on the sheet music or whatever. And I think it's a mixed bag, because when you're talking about the Negro spiritual, by and large, they were written for religious purposes. And I just want to make this point, because even if I can't answer in detail your question, the important thing to keep in mind is that one of my criteria was that these songs, the slave songs anyway, were written by slaves or former slaves. That's a very different distinction, because I didn't choose songs that were religious. That was the whole point. There's plenty of those songs. I mean, you can go to the Library of Congress and you'll find book after book that says, these are slave songs. But actually, most of them are not written by slaves. Most of them were written by church congregations because they were propagating Jesus. That's fine. I'm not saying that that's bad. I'm just saying that that's what we have been told. That's what the Negro spiritual is. The point is that these songs, which often use the same music, were composed by slaves or former slaves, and they were using that music for this purpose. That's the difference. Right. Well, I mean, the truth is, it is true. You're also right that many of the Negro spirituals are indeed coded speech and are clearly designed to express the desire for freedom. That is true. But my point was that these are explicit. There's no way you can misinterpret the message, and they were connected directly to actual rebellions. So I guess we're out of time. Oh, yeah.
One last question from Susan. Susan, yes, it's working.
I'm from Brazil.
Yeah.
The last country in the Americas that liberated slaves.
Right.
Which is a shame. And my great-grandpa was a runaway slave.
Yeah.
And we had capoeira.
Yep.
As everybody knew, as a cultural dance.
Yeah.
But that was a fight.
Right.
They were rehearsing how to fight.
Yeah.
And to get their own quilombos, which would be their freedom cities.
Yeah.
And they were atrociously killed by the Portuguese and the Dutch. And the only reason that Princess Isabel wrote that magnificent letter about freeing the slaves was because the British were on the Atlantic, waiting to see her response. You guys are still profiting from slaves? We told everybody not to. So if you don't stop this, we're going to invade you, and we start a war. So the only reason that there was the end of slavery in Brazil was the economic reason, a threat from the British. So I'm wondering how much the revolts, insurrections that happened here were actually really the reason that the Northern abolitionists were thinking about it, because as I start to think, you don't have to pay for them to leave. They can become your employees, and when they are done, you just fire them or let them to their own will. That's why there was no reconstruction after the war. So I'm thinking about capitalism here was the reason that there was no reconstruction. And the music that I hear from slavery in Brazil are in their own language from Africa, and that we try not to put them as good Christians with Christian church songs to tell them they are good Samaritans, that they were trying to, have a Christian kind of soul. And the instruments were percussionist instruments that we can hear the beat of Africa in their hearts and souls. So I'm wondering if you could find any percussion music behind your research and not only church music that was brought from England.
Mm-hmm. Do I have time? I mean, okay. I'm sorry, but I'm staring at the clock.
Let's do 1:45 instead of 12:30.
Very quickly, first of all, the subject of Brazil, Cuba, other places, other languages, that's wide open. It should be researched. I am sure that similar songs and whatever will be found if people research them. I'm certain of that. I had to limit myself to get this thing out, but I'm just saying I am sure that doing the research will find that. As far as the question of Christian songs, Christian music, whatever, that's my whole point, is that the use of what was available for this purpose, not only available in the sense that a person could sing this melody, but available in the sense that everybody else knew the melody. So the purpose was, as I said, if you're going to take a hymn of freedom to prepare for an insurrection, and you take a song that is being sung everywhere, you mean the national anthem of the United States, and you're going to turn it into its opposite, that's what you're going to do, because everybody knows the song, everybody gets the point, it's clear. So the point is that it's not a question of origins or authenticity, it's a question of use. What are you going to do? You want to free yourself. You're fighting a battle. That's the whole thing. Now, as far as the other aspect of that, say drumming and things like that, drumming was forbidden in the United States. Well, it wasn't the United States, it's the British colonies. The British forbid drumming because they knew that it was dangerous. They understood the role that it played. And there are examples of other songs or poems or whatever from earlier times that clearly indicate what was the sentiment of the enslaved population. But as far as them being written down, they were written down, at this time, late 18th century, because slaves were illiterate. They had become literate in English. They could write their feelings, their thoughts, their ideas. And as a matter of fact, and this is the key point, what really proved that there was such material was not songs, it was poetry. It was the poetry that was written. Folk song collectors never heard this stuff. They didn't hear it. But historians found the written record. Do you see that? It's a very key distinction because this music is ephemeral. It happens and it's gone. But things that are written and put on paper, historians find. Folklorists go out and listen, right? They didn't hear it. Historians found the written record, which in many cases were slaves writing poetry and saying the same thing. So I knew that the ideas were circulating. They were, so how to find them. So it doesn't completely answer the question, which is a big subject in itself, but that's what I found. And we're just about out of time. We could talk about this afterwards too. This doesn't have to be all public, but.
Matt Callahan, you take an amazing songwriter and performer and you add scholarly rigor to it, and it's just an amazing thing. I was thinking of our stable of wonderful presenters and experts and scientists and visionaries that we have. And Matt Callahan, thank you for being with us. We have a few copies of all three of Matt's projects: Songs of Freedom, the James Connolly project, Working Class Heroes, and the one we're talking about this morning, which is called Songs of Slavery and Emancipation. Just a wonderful work, a wonderful body of oeuvre of Matt Callahan. So folks, we're going to suspend for a short while and come back for our annual meeting. Before, we might lose some folks, but I want to tell you that if you're interested in the product of our annual meeting, it's our report, our yearbook for this season, and it's beautifully compiled by Crystal Rollins Jackson, and it has all of the committee reports and some financial information, and also a summation of all of the presentations we've had in this room, which adds up to about 60 or 70 events, both the 35 or so Sunday events, as well as all kinds of weeknight events. They're all compiled in here. So this is the book. We can send it to you electronically, as well as send you a copy by mail. Just be in touch with us and let us know. We are going to send it to all the membership, which will receive it by mail and electronically. And if more of you would like a copy, just let us know and we'll send it to you. And that's just a little reminder: become a member. Join us. We have about 8 or 9 new members during this past season, and we'd like you to consider the same. Come to the church on a Wednesday when we have our open house at noon, and we can tell you all about what's involved in membership. We are non-sectarian, non-creedal. There's no litmus test. There's no, you have to accept Jesus Christ as your personal Savior before you become a member. There's nothing like that. You just have to agree to be enthusiastically excited about what it is we do here, and join us. And we support you, you support us, all together. That's a final membership pitch before we suspend briefly for a delicious lunch from Luis Guzman here in the auditorium, and we will resume the meeting maybe a little bit after 1, but we will come back together and have our annual meeting.